All right, guys, so today we're going to be focusing on Chapter 1, Key Issue 4, Why Are Some Human Actions Not Sustainable? So this is our very last key issue for Chapter 1, wrapping up Unit 1, and this is going to focus on our last theme of geography, which is human-environment interaction. So how humans interact with the environment and how the environment impacts humans. Now, we're going to bring up this topic many more times as we go throughout our different units, but we still have to have sort of a baseline of what we're talking about in terms of some of our definitions. So the first thing we're going to talk about is resources. Resources are substances in the environment that are useful to people and are also feasible to access. So just because it exists in the earth, that's great, but if we can't access it, then we can't necessarily use it. So obviously our technology has allowed us to access more resources and use them in different ways, but if we can't get to them, then there's really no value to them to humans. Okay, so until humans decide it has value, that resource is just a part of nature. But we're going to talk about some of those examples of resources as we go, but one of them would be natural gas. Natural gas, until relatively recently, was just burned off at oil sites. But it has since been used and harnessed as another source of energy that's used in people's homes. So if you have a stove that when you turn it on, you see flame, that's a natural gas stove. Your clothing dryer might use natural gas. Your hot water heater might use natural gas, or your furnace. So for most Americans, natural gas is now a part of your home in many different ways. Okay, so it's used quite often and it's pipelined throughout the region. All right, now potential resources are resources that are useful, but we might not have the technology to feasibly attain it. Okay, so for example, resources like uranium are deep within the Himalayas, but we might not have the resources to dig that deep to have access to them. All right, so there's two types of resources, renewable and non-renewable resources. Now, renewable resources are going to be resources that are produced in nature more rapidly than it is consumed by humans. Okay, so for example, trees. We can cut down trees, we can replant trees, and they will regrow within our lifetime. We would consider that rapid replenishment. So it's something that will constantly be available to us. Now, if we cut down trees more quickly without them being replenished, that leads to deforestation. Okay, but we also have a sort of extension of renewable energy is what we call inexhaustible energy resources. So wind, solar, and geothermal. We're never not going to have wind. We're always going to have the sun. If we don't have the sun, then we're not going to be here. So those are going to be some of the ways that we're trying to harness other energy resources, not or inexhaustible resources, in terms of solar panels, wind turbines, to use that rather than our non-renewable resources like oil. Okay, a non-renewable resource is a resource that once we use it, it's gone. Okay, now obviously some of our fossil fuels, our mineral resources, they could be replenished, but it's going to take millions of years. So that's in our lifetime not a feasible replenishment, and so it would be considered extremely slow. So it's non-renewable. Once it's used, it's gone. Okay, we're not getting it back. So when it comes to nuclear energy, we often put that in the non-renewable energy side of things because once the energy is taken out, it just becomes waste. Okay, once coal is used, fossil fuel, natural gas, it's non-renewable. And then renewable, we have biomass energy, but we also have those inexhaustible resources like solar, hydropower, geothermal, and wind energy as well. All right, now we do have a lot of abuses of resources. One of the big issues we have is exhausting non-renewable resources, using way too much, way too fast, to the point where coal mines are closed down because they got all the coal that was feasible to access out of it. Okay, here's a depleted oil field in Baku in Azerbaijan. Okay, so once all that oil is taken out of that particular location, then it's done. Here's a depleted coal mine in Colombia. And the other major misuse of resources is not only depleting our non-renewable resources, but also depleting renewable resources through pollution and mismanagement. So in terms of water, there's obviously a lot of water in the world, especially in the oceans. Fresh water is going to be a little more difficult, especially if we're polluting or mismanaging it. That's going to be problematic in terms of our long-term access and reliability of safe, clean drinking water. All right, an example of a resource that was destroyed is the Aral Sea. Now, the Aral Sea, as you can see, borders Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It was the fourth largest inland body of water in the world. But in the 1960s, the Soviet Union dammed the sources of water to the sea and used that fresh water for cotton irrigation. Cotton is a crop that requires a lot of water, and if it's grown in a dry place, you need even more water from other sources in order to have it grow. Now, with the inflow of that fresh water going into the Aral Sea eventually is going to basically cease to exist. Now, if you look at the Aral Sea from 1977 to 2010, you can see how much it's been depleted. Now, these images were gathered via remote sensing and were put into the GIS, and GIS scientists analyze this data to see what we have now and put these pictures next to each other. All right, so the desiccation of the Aral Sea in Central Asia is problematic, of course, not just for like fishing as a food source, but also for tourism as well. And it's going to greatly impact the economies of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. All right, so how do we fix this problem? How do we respond to this environmental degradation? Really, we have to look at 3 pillars of sustainability. So sustainability is just making sure that we're responsibly using our resources to prevent environmental catastrophe. Now, sustainability experts believe that we have to have all 3 of these pillars working together. You can't just do one of them. If you only do one of them, then it's not going to work long term. So you need to have the environment, economy, and society pillar. So conservation must be embraced. Preservation should be done where possible. We'll talk about those in a moment. Economy is prices of resources should reflect the true environmental costs. Okay, so for example, like I mentioned, cotton is one of those crops. It requires a lot of fresh water. It's usually grown in places that are more arid, which takes fresh water, drinking water away from humans. Okay, it also is something that takes a lot of nutrients out of the soil, so can impact arability of land long term. But clothing is one of the cheapest things we can buy as Americans because of mass production and globalization of these products. Okay, so if we really wanted to be serious about this, then t-shirts would be more expensive because of their environmental cost. The society pillar is changing what people want and what they need, and changing what they think is important for sustainable production long term. Okay, so all 3 of these have to work together to create a sustainable environment. Now, conservation is limiting human use of resources. So we can still use a resource, but we should limit the amount and the extent of human interaction. Preservation is trying to leave nature as it's found in its natural condition. Okay, so setting aside a forest preserve or a natural preserve, but not putting in any walking paths or hiking paths, not allowing any human interaction whatsoever. That's preservation. Conservation is setting aside a place like a national park, where you can go and visit, you could drive through, you can hike, but still severely limiting human interaction in that particular place. So you see in conservation, it's still mostly green. There's some pockets of human interaction, but it's used sustainably. Preservation is leaving it completely natural in its natural state. Okay, so when it comes to Earth's physical systems, I'm just going to go through these real quick. You guys have been hearing this in science class since elementary school, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But just so we know, biotic is systems that are composed of living organisms. Abiotic is non-living matter. Okay, and we have to look at these 4 interrelated systems to see how we impact the environment and how the environment impacts us. So we look at the atmosphere, which is abiotic, that thin layer of gas. We look at the hydrosphere, all the water on or near Earth's surface. So not the stuff living in the water that would make it biotic, but the water itself is abiotic. The lithosphere is the crust and the layers just below the crust. And of course, the biosphere, all those living organisms on Earth, which is biotic. All right. Now, one important thing we're going to be looking at in terms of human-environment interaction, and one of the proofs of the impact of humans, is climate versus weather. Now, there's sort of this belief that, climate change isn't happening because it snows in the winter, okay? So therefore, climate change isn't occurring, or global warming is a term, often used. But climate and weather are 2 different things. Climate is a long-term patterns. Okay, so the fact that it's hot here in the summer, it's cold in the winter, that's our climate. That's our long-term variables. But what we start to track and trend for is it becoming just slightly warmer in the winter, or, just a little bit less cold in the winter? Not that we won't have cold days, but are they, few and far between? Are we getting more or less rainfall, or are hurricanes becoming more powerful? Those are the things we're looking at in terms of climate. Weather is at day to day. We turn on the news and it tells us it's going to be a high of 90 degrees and sunny today. That's the weather. The climate is going to be that long-term variability. Now, we look at Köppen's biomes, we're looking at those major climate regions, which are kind of shifting and changing a little bit as we see the impact of human-environment interaction. We tend to use these 5 main categories of tropical, dry, temperate, continental, and polar. Okay, so you can see like where we live, we're kind of in between these 2 areas of temperate and continental, at different parts of the Midwest. All right, but this brings us to a big concept, environmental determinism versus possibilism. Now, one of these big concepts, environmental determinism, is a belief that the physical environment causes or guides social development. Now, this is going to be sort of a more old school, a little more racist viewpoint in terms of the ability of people who live in certain climates. So a lot of Europeans who come from a more temperate continental climate, they believed, because of environmental determinism, that since they lived in those climates and they had a certain geographic environment, that therefore they were more civilized and had to adapt to that climate in different ways. People in warmer climates, more tropical climates, they didn't have to necessarily work as hard, so they're lazy, they're brutish, they're uncivilized. So those of us who are in the cooler climates, who are more civilized, it's our job to civilize these savages. All right, so hopefully you can see how problematic environmental determinism is. The idea that the climate that you grew up in impacts or guides your social development, your intellectual development. Now, in this day and age, people have kind of seen that as extremely problematic. Now, there's this one guy, we're actually going to watch his documentary when we get to our agriculture unit, Jared Diamond, who's actually very well respected, and not for these racial reasons, but he's also a bit of an environmental determinist, sort of in a newer sense. Not to say that the environment determines everything of what you can or do or become, but it might have an impact on why civilizations have developed in the way that they have. So his sort of groundbreaking book in this is called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And like I said, when we get to agriculture, we'll watch part of his documentary about it to kind of get a sense of the new version of environmental determinism. But the flip side of environmental determinism is something called possibilism. And that's really replaced determinism for the most part. The idea that no matter where you're from, no matter what climate region you or your ancestors are from, that people have the ability to react to and master their surroundings, no matter what the challenges are. So, for example, and again, in agriculture, we'll talk about this. One of my favorite things is when we talk about agriculture, there's parts of Asia that are, on the surface, seemingly non-arable. So in the mountains in China, it does not seem like a place where you would have a lot of agriculture happen in such a rocky, mountainous place. But because of possibilism, over hundreds of years, the mountainsides have been carved into and man-made rice paddies were created. And so that's possibilism in action. Even though the environment is not conducive to agriculture, people reacted to and they mastered those surroundings to allow for that agriculture to take place to feed the population. All right, so in terms of case studies, we're going to look at how human modification can sometimes go well, sometimes it's going to go bad. Now, as you can see, we have Netherlands and South Florida. You might be able to figure out right now which country did it better, which country did it worse. Let's talk first about the Netherlands. Netherlands is on the forefront of sustainable modification. Basically, the Netherlands is at sea level. Some places it's even below sea level in the Netherlands. So in order to make sure the whole country isn't underwater, they basically created something called polders. And polders are pieces of land that have been reclaimed after the water's drained off of it. So if land was flooded, they build a series of dikes, and then they're going to pump water off the land to now create more land for human habitation, for agriculture. And they call that land polder. Okay, so sorry for not the greatest graphic, but it helps out to kind of visualize it. It's in Dutch, So that's why the language looks a little off. Okay, so a dike is going to be historically an earthen wall. Now sometimes they're cement, sometimes they still use earthen walls, and it's going to create a barrier between the canal, the waterway, and the land. Okay, so that dike is going to create that wall, and then they're going to use a mill, and we should know about mills in Batavia, Windmill City. They're going to use mills to operate pumps to pump the water off the land and create polder, usable land. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So over here we have these earthen walls. We have these dikes that keep the water out, the seawater's out. And then over here we have polder. We have that land that's reclaimed off of the land that was once underwater. Now they also created a freshwater lake. So Lake Isle was once part of the sea, and they created a series of dikes, and they stopped the flow of salt water, and eventually it became a freshwater lake. So not only did they create more land, but they also created a source of fresh water. So you can see all those different colors were land that was once underwater that's now been reclaimed. Now, as we see, our ocean levels are rising as an effect of global warming, the Netherlands is still on the forefront of trying to fight global warming because they're going to be one of those countries that's going to be underwater if the sea levels rise. So they're going to try to use more of those inexhaustible energy resources rather than fossil fuels in order to fight global warming. Florida, unsustainable. Okay, they created some highly unsustainable modifications that have been made to the ecosystem of the Everglades, which has become extremely problematic. Okay, so as you can see in South Florida, Everglades National Park, but basically it is one of the most interesting and diverse ecosystems in the world. But there's going to be some interaction that takes place to help grow the economy of Florida, but has made a terrible lasting impression on the ecosystem of Florida. The Kissimmee River that flows through this region was straightened, destroying a lot of its natural functions that feeds into the Everglades. Lake Okeechobee has become poisoned by the surrounding farms using pesticides. That pesticide has run off and gone into the lake, killing the sea life or the lake life that lives there. And then we see that the Everglades have basically been poisoned by fertilizers. Okay, so when it comes to between Florida and Netherlands, we can see a very clear difference of human modification gone wrong versus what needs to happen to support sustainability.